The night had fallen heavy over Montecito, and the quiet hum of the California evening seemed to mask the storm that was about to erupt inside the walls of Harry and Meghan's home. For years, their relationship had been painted as a love story that dared to challenge tradition, a tale of passion, rebellion, and escape from the suffocating grip of royal life. Yet, behind the carefully curated photographs, behind the carefully worded interviews and the staged smiles, cracks had begun to spread across the very foundation of their marriage. What the world was about to witness was not simply the unraveling of a relationship, it was the collapse of an empire built on their names. And in the middle of it all was Meghan Markle, screaming in a voice that could rattle glass, as she slapped the man she once vowed to love until death. The beginning of any love story is often filled with euphoria, but this one carried weight from the very start. Meghan and Harry had not entered into marriage in a quiet cocoon of privacy. Theirs was a union lit by flashing cameras, dissected by the global press, and debated by every corner of society. People didn't just watch them marry, they projected their hopes, their criticisms, and their doubts onto them. For Meghan, the marriage was more than love. It was a platform, a chance to redefine what it meant to be royal, a chance to shake the crown itself. For Harry, it was salvation, a woman who gave him what the institution of the monarchy never had: unconditional loyalty, a sense of being seen. Or so he thought. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But over time, the pressure grew unbearable. The fairy tale was sustained on delicate balance. Meghan, wanting freedom yet demanding recognition, and Harry, torn between love and duty, between protecting his wife and grappling with the monarchy he left behind. Friends noticed subtle changes in Harry. His once easy smile began to fade. His voice carried a weight it had not before. His posture stiffened in public appearances as though every step was forced. Meghan, on the other hand, became more determined, more restless. Her ambitions soared while his spirit waned, and the distance between them grew into an abyss neither could cross. The decisive moment didn't come suddenly. It built like a slow-moving earthquake. Arguments became routine. Harry longed for a quieter life, perhaps a return to military work or simply raising his children out of the spotlight. Meghan's eyes were still set on Hollywood, on influence, on global recognition. Their differences weren't just disagreements. They were two people pulling in opposite directions with equal force. The tension became unbearable, and for Harry, the thought of divorce no longer seemed like betrayal. It seemed like survival. Filing those papers was his final act of reclaiming a piece of himself that had been buried under the weight of expectation and manipulation. But how do you break news like that to someone like Meghan Markle? Meghan, whose identity had become intertwined with Harry's name, with his title, with the symbolic power of being the Duchess of Sussex. Harry didn't break it to her himself at first. He confided in lawyers, in a trusted circle, and believed he could control the timing. Yet secrets have a way of seeping out, and when Meghan finally discovered the truth, the sound of her rage shook every wall in that California estate. She screamed, not just at the betrayal of a husband, but at the collapse of the empire she thought she controlled. In her fury, she lashed out physically, her hand striking across Harry's face, not as a wife scorned, but as a woman whose power was slipping away before her very eyes. The slap was more than an act of anger. It was symbolic of everything their marriage had become: toxic, volatile, rooted not in trust, but in a constant battle for dominance. For Harry, that moment was confirmation that he had made the right decision. For Meghan, it was a wound deeper than the sting of betrayal. It was humiliation, the realization that the man she believed she could keep tethered had finally broken free. The news, of course, did not stay contained within their walls. The royal family was already aware of the fractures. Whispers had long circulated through Buckingham Palace corridors about how long this could last. But now, with divorce papers filed, the stakes were no longer personal. They were institutional. For King Charles and Prince William, this was not just a family tragedy, but a political one, a matter of monarchy reputation and legacy. For Meghan, however, it was survival. She could not allow herself to be cast as the woman who ruined Harry and then lost him. What followed that night in Montecito was chaos. Shouts echoed, doors slammed, and neighbors later reported unusual commotion at the estate. Some claimed they heard the crying of children, others swore they saw security rushing in. The truth was simple. Meghan Markle had been blindsided, and her reaction was visceral. The image of her slapping Harry was destined to become a metaphor, a private act with public consequences, the symbol of a crumbling love story that once captivated the globe. But how did it get to this point? How does a couple who once declared they would fight the world together end up fighting each other in their own home? The truth lies in the fragility of their bond, the weight of fame, and the conflicting desires that neither could compromise. Meghan wanted to rise higher. Harry wanted to step back. Meghan sought influence. Harry longed for peace. The two roads diverged so sharply that eventually, one had to make the break. And Harry, the prince who once gave up his family for her, now gave up on her entirely. Filing for divorce was not just an act of legal separation. It was an emotional declaration. He would no longer be bound by the chains of a relationship that drained him. Meghan's scream, her slap, her tears, these were not just reactions, but evidence of a deeper truth. The woman who once seemed invincible, the actress who charmed a prince and stood before the world as his equal, had been caught completely unprepared. That is the story the world will remember, not simply of a divorce, but of a woman screaming in pain at the loss of her grip, and a man finally walking away from the chaos he once embraced. The introduction of this unraveling tale is not just about one night. It is about years of tension, unspoken resentments, and a marriage that was never as strong as it appeared on glossy magazine covers. And yet, this is only the beginning. What comes next will shake not only Harry and Meghan's lives, but the monarchy itself. Allies will turn, secrets will surface, and the fallout will stretch far beyond the walls of that Montecito mansion. For if a love story that once stood against the world can collapse so dramatically, what else has been hidden all along? From the outside, their life looked like a dream. Palm trees swayed in the breeze. The sunlit hills of Montecito wrapped their mansion in golden warmth, and glossy photographs painted Harry and Meghan as a modern couple thriving in a world free from the iron grip of Buckingham Palace. But appearances deceive, and beneath the glamour lay a marriage weighed down by unspoken resentments, frustrations, and a gulf between two people who once promised each other everything. This chapter is about that slow erosion, the breaking point that would eventually send Harry to file for divorce. It was not one explosive moment that shattered the union. It was 1,000 small cuts, each leaving a scar. Harry had always been defined by conflict. The boy who lost his mother at such a tender age grew into a man haunted by duty and the shadows of the crown. When Meghan entered his life, she became more than a partner. She was the escape hatch, the person who convinced him he could rewrite his story. But what Harry never realized was that Meghan, too, carried a vision for her life, one that did not always align with his. She wanted global recognition, Hollywood influence, and the power to shape narratives on her own terms. Harry's vision was quieter, a family shielded from the noise, a chance to raise children without the press lurking behind every fence. The friction between their dreams started as whispers but grew into thunder. In the early months of their life in California, their bond still held. They made public appearances, gave interviews, and spoke about mental health, family struggles, and independence. Yet behind the cameras, Harry began to notice the exhaustion in himself. He had thought leaving the royal family would liberate him, that he could finally breathe, but instead, he felt chained to a new kind of machine: Hollywood contracts, media interviews, and endless brand deals. Meghan thrived in this environment, but Harry wilted. Every photo shoot, every Netflix meeting, every speech they gave seemed to drain him further, and when he tried to pull away, it caused arguments that cut deeper each time. Their friends, too, saw it. Meghan's circle of allies expanded: celebrities, producers, influential figures who offered her platforms. Harry, on the other hand, began to feel like a guest in his own marriage, a supporting actor in Meghan's script. He missed his old life, the camaraderie of the military, the brotherhood of soldiers, the freedom of anonymity when he could slip unnoticed into a pub. When he confessed this to Meghan, her response wasn't tender understanding, but a sharp reminder that they had sacrificed too much to go backward. "We're building something here," she reportedly told him one evening. This isn't about hiding, it's about shining. That word, shining, stuck with Harry. For Meghan, visibility was power. For Harry, it was torment. The more she sought the spotlight, the more he retreated into himself. At public events, cameras caught Harry looking stiff, distant, while Meghan carried the smile for both of them. The press, once again, noticed and began to speculate. Was Harry unhappy? Was the marriage cracking? These whispers only intensified Meghan's determination to prove the world wrong, which in turn only deepened Harry's quiet resentment. Arguments turned bitter. Meghan accused Harry of being ungrateful, of failing to understand that the world respected him more because of her. Harry accused her of caring more about image than about him or their children. Nights that once ended in laughter now ended in silence, or worse, in slammed doors. They fought about money, about security, about their children's upbringing. Meghan wanted them in private schools that offered connections to Hollywood elites. Harry wanted them shielded from the trappings of fame. Even the smallest things became battles. Where to spend holidays, which interviews to accept, which friends to trust. The breaking point came gradually, but it solidified during a trip where Harry expected peace. He had arranged for them to visit a quiet retreat away from the glare of the media, hoping the time away would rekindle their bond. But Meghan saw it differently. She brought along her team, treated the trip as an opportunity to capture content and strategize her next moves. Harry, once again, felt ignored, sidelined. A heated argument erupted one night in their villa, with Harry yelling that he was done being a prop in her story. Meghan, furious, accused him of weakness, of not understanding the stakes of their position. That night, Harry realized something inside him had shifted permanently. He no longer saw Meghan as his partner in escape. He saw her as the very cage he had tried to flee. And so, the thought of divorce entered his mind, not as a fleeting frustration, but as a concrete plan. He began to speak in hushed tones with advisors, asking what it would mean for his children, what it would cost, and how it would play out in the public eye. The very fact that he was asking these questions was proof enough. The marriage was collapsing. Still, Harry wasn't entirely hardened. There were moments of softness, moments when Meghan's charm reminded him of why he fell for her. She could be magnetic, persuasive, even tender when she chose. But those moments became fewer, and they no longer outweighed the constant fights. Harry's spirit eroded a little more each day until he reached the inevitable conclusion. Staying would destroy him. Leaving, painful as it would be, was the only way to salvage what remained of himself. The breaking point wasn't marked by one explosion, but by countless fractures that spread until the foundation could no longer hold. It was the long silences, the unspoken resentments, the exhaustion of two people who could no longer see a shared future. For Harry, it was the night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing he felt more alone lying next to his wife than he ever had before. For Meghan, it was the moment she sensed the shift, that subtle but undeniable pulling away that told her something had changed, and that her control might be slipping. This was not yet the moment of divorce filing, nor the night of screams and slaps. But it was the prelude. It was the quiet before the storm, the cracks that foretold the collapse. The breaking point had been reached, and though neither would admit it openly yet, both knew they were teetering on the edge of an unraveling that the world would soon see in all its raw, unfiltered chaos. The decision did not come easily, but once it was made, Prince Harry found himself entering a world he never thought he would inhabit, the secret, calculated process of divorce. Filing for separation wasn't just about ending a marriage. For him, it meant dismantling a life that had been built on sacrifice, rebellion, and promises whispered between two people who swore they would stand against the world together. Now, he was forced to do something that would undoubtedly ignite chaos, not just in his household, but across the globe. This chapter is about the shadowy steps Harry took to begin the process, the clandestine meetings, the silences he carried, and the burden of knowing he was about to detonate the very foundation of his marriage. It began with quiet inquiries. Harry could not confide in his closest friends, not when so many had already been alienated by Meghan. He could not risk telling members of the royal family, not yet, for fear it would leak to the press before he was ready. Instead, he reached out to trusted contacts who had once handled delicate matters for him in the past. Lawyers who operated in absolute discretion, men and women who understood the stakes of working with a royal figure whose every move could become front-page news. Harry used secure lines, burner phones even, to ensure nothing could be traced back to him. He had learned enough about the ferocity of the British tabloids to know that one careless slip could destroy everything before it began. The lawyers laid out the options: California law, British law, international treaties. All the complexities of his unusual status were laid bare. There were questions of custody, of property, of titles, of finances tied up in deals that bore both their names. Even the matter of Archewell, their joint foundation, hung precariously in the balance. How would it be divided? Could it survive a split? These weren't just legal questions. They were questions of identity, of who Harry would be without Meghan by his side. The process was long, tedious, and filled with minefields. Every decision had to be weighed not only for its legal impact, but for its public consequences. Harry struggled with secrecy. He lived under the same roof as Meghan, yet he carried a burden she could not see. Nights when she was busy planning future projects or taking calls with producers, he would retreat into his private office, poring over documents, scrolling through emails encrypted to vanish after being read. He signed papers in silence, his hands trembling not from doubt, but from the enormity of what he was doing. Each signature felt like a betrayal and a liberation all at once. The secrecy took a toll on him. At dinners, Meghan would talk animatedly about upcoming ventures, and Harry would nod along, his heart pounding as he wondered how she would react when she discovered the truth. Their children's laughter echoed in the background, and Harry felt guilt clawing at him. Was he destroying their family? Or was he saving them from a life defined by conflict and unhappiness? These questions gnawed at him, but deep down, he knew the answer: staying would be far worse. The environment had become toxic, and he had to break free before it consumed him entirely. In these quiet weeks, Harry became a different man. He was colder, more guarded, retreating inward in ways Meghan began to notice. She asked him once, "What's wrong with you lately? You're distant. You're not here." Harry brushed it off, claiming stress, but inside he knew she was right. He was no longer fully present. He was living in two worlds. The one Meghan thought they shared, and the secret one he was building, brick by brick, in preparation for the split. The lawyers advised him to keep everything as quiet as possible until the filing was complete. Any leak could give Meghan the upper hand. If she knew too soon, she could rally her media allies, paint Harry as unstable, and turn public opinion against him before he had a chance to present his side. The strategy was clear: file in secrecy, secure the papers, and then confront her with a reality she could not undo. For a man who had lived his entire life in the public eye, secrecy was both a shield and a torment. Meanwhile, Meghan continued life as if nothing was wrong. She was focused on her brand, her image, her future projects. To her, Harry's silence was simply another mood swing, something she could charm him out of when necessary. She had no idea that every affectionate gesture she made, every soft smile or strategic embrace for the cameras, was being cataloged by Harry not as evidence of love, but as performance. He no longer believed in the story they told the world. There was one evening that stood out in Harry's mind as the moment he knew there was no turning back. Meghan had organized a lavish dinner with Hollywood executives in their home. The table sparkled with expensive wines and curated dishes, and Meghan dazzled in a designer gown, working the room with skill and grace. Harry sat at the edge of the conversation, barely speaking, watching his wife laugh and charm. One of the guests raised a glass and toasted to the most powerful couple of our time. The room erupted in applause, but Harry's chest tightened. He didn't feel powerful, he felt trapped. When Meghan caught his eye across the table, she smiled as though everything was perfect, but Harry knew in that instant. Their visions for life were irreconcilable. After the dinner, when Meghan retired upstairs, Harry sat alone in the quiet dining room, staring at the remnants of the night's performance. Plates half filled with food, wine glasses stained with lipstick, laughter still echoing faintly in his ears. He picked up his phone, opened the secure line to his lawyer, and sent a single message: "Proceed." From that moment, the process accelerated. Documents were drawn up, financial assessments were made, and custody considerations were prepared in advance. Harry's legal team worked with precision, knowing the backlash would be immense once the filing became public. For Harry, the weight of secrecy only grew heavier. He woke up each morning beside Meghan, knowing a storm was building in the shadows, a storm she could not yet see. What haunted him most was the thought of her reaction. Meghan was not someone who accepted defeat easily. He knew she would fight, that her scream would be louder than any headline, that her fury would reach heights most could not imagine. But he also knew there was no avoiding it. He could not live another year in the prison their marriage had become. Filing in secret was his way of reclaiming the freedom he had once thought Meghan offered him, the freedom he realized she had taken away. The secret filing was not just a legal maneuver. It was a declaration of war disguised as a quiet act. Harry was no longer the man running from the crown for Meghan's sake. He was a man reclaiming his own life, even if it meant detonating the fragile image they had built together. And as the papers moved through the system, awaiting the day when they would shatter Meghan's world, Harry braced himself for the inevitable. The confrontation that would tear open the wounds of their marriage and expose them for all the world to see. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply one tries to bury it. For Harry, the secrecy of his divorce filing was a necessary shield, a way to preserve his sanity and prepare himself for the inevitable storm. But for Meghan, discovery came like a lightning bolt out of a clear sky, sudden, blinding, and impossible to ignore. The moment she found out was not simply an emotional reaction. It was a rupture, a cataclysm that turned a house into a battlefield and love into rage. This chapter unfolds that moment of revelation, the chaos it unleashed, and the raw human emotions that tore through the walls of their Montecito home. It began innocently enough. Meghan had grown suspicious of Harry's behavior in recent weeks. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and less inclined to engage in their usual discussions about projects and appearances. At first, she dismissed it as stress. Harry had always struggled with the weight of his past, and she often cast herself as his savior. But there were signs she couldn't ignore. The late-night phone calls behind closed doors, the hushed tone when she entered the room, the papers he quickly tucked away when she approached. Meghan, ever intuitive and calculating, knew something was wrong. The discovery came when she stumbled upon an email. Harry had left his laptop open, perhaps carelessly, perhaps subconsciously wanting to be caught. The message, though brief, was devastating in its clarity. It was from his lawyer, confirming the next steps in finalizing the divorce filing. Meghan froze as her eyes scanned the words. For a woman who had always prided herself on control, on anticipating every move before it happened, the shock was unbearable. Her chest tightened, her hands trembled, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The man she had built her life around, the man she believed she could mold into her vision, had made a move without her consent, without her knowledge, and without her influence. When Harry entered the room moments later, he found Meghan standing rigid, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with fury. The silence between them was thick, electric. She held up the screen and whispered, almost disbelievingly, "What is this?" But it wasn't really a question. It was an accusation, a demand for explanation, and a warning all at once. Harry, caught between guilt and resolve, tried to steady his voice. "It's what I had to do," he said, the words heavy with finality. That single sentence cracked the dam. Meghan's face contorted, her composure shattered, and the scream that escaped her shook the very walls. It wasn't a scream of pain alone. It was rage, humiliation, disbelief, and fear colliding into one primal sound. She screamed not only at Harry but at the betrayal, at the collapse of everything she thought she controlled. Her fury spiraled quickly. Words flew from her lips, sharp and cutting, accusations hurled like daggers. "After everything I gave up for you? After everything we built? You coward!" Her voice rose higher, each syllable carrying venom. She accused him of betrayal, of weakness, of letting the world dictate his choices. She mocked his need for peace, derided his longing for normalcy, and threw at him every sacrifice she claimed to have made. Harry stood, stoic at first, then defensive, reminding her that love was not supposed to feel like suffocation. And then it happened. In a blur of motion, Meghan's hand struck across Harry's face. The slap rang out, a sound both shocking and symbolic. Harry staggered slightly, not from the force alone, but from the realization of what it represented. The physical manifestation of years of tension, the embodiment of a relationship corroded by resentment. Meghan gasped immediately afterward, as though even she hadn't expected her anger to erupt that way. But the damage was done. The slap was more than a moment. It was a scar that would never fade. The silence that followed was deafening. Harry touched his cheek, his eyes locked on Meghan's, and in that instant, the last thread of their bond snapped. For him, the slap confirmed what he already knew. Their marriage had crossed into irreparable territory. For Meghan, it was the moment she realized the empire she had built around their union was collapsing before her eyes. Neighbors later claimed they heard shouting that night, voices rising and falling like waves in a storm. Some swore they heard furniture being knocked over. Others said the children's cries echoed faintly into the night air. Whether true or not, the perception alone fed into the narrative of a household in chaos. And within those walls, the confrontation continued. Meghan wept openly, then returned to rage, then back to pleading, cycling through every stage of shock and grief within hours. She begged Harry to reconsider, threatened him with exposure, promised him a future if only he tore up the papers. But Harry remained unmoved. The decision had been made, and he would not be swayed. What shook Meghan most wasn't just the divorce, it was the secrecy. She prided herself on being the strategist, the one who knew everything before anyone else. But here, she had been blindsided. Harry had moved without her knowledge, had plotted his exit in silence, and had kept her in the dark until she stumbled upon the truth. That humiliation was unbearable. For Meghan, the scream and the slap were not just expressions of anger. They were desperate attempts to regain control, to reassert dominance in a situation where she felt powerless for the first time in years. Harry, though shaken, did not respond with violence or even anger. He simply stood his ground, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and resolve. "I can't live like this anymore," he told her quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This isn't love. This isn't what I signed up for. I need to be free." Those words, simple as they were, cut deeper than any slap. Meghan crumpled to the floor, her sobs filling the room, as Harry walked away, not from the house, not yet, but from the version of their marriage that had once seemed unbreakable. By morning, the air in the mansion was heavy, suffocating. Meghan avoided Harry, retreating into her private quarters, while he spent hours pacing, calling his legal team, and preparing for the next wave. The slap, the scream, the confrontation, they were all burned into his mind. He knew the battle ahead would not be easy, but he also knew he had crossed the point of no return. The moment Meghan found out had changed everything. The facade of unity was gone, the illusion shattered, and the world would soon know what had happened behind closed doors. For Meghan, the discovery was not just about divorce papers. It was about losing control of the narrative, about being blindsided in a way she had never imagined. For Harry, it was liberation, painful but necessary, the final confirmation that his path forward lay not with her, but without her. The scream, the slap, the night of chaos. These would become the symbols of their unraveling, the private storm that foretold a very public war. The slap was not merely a private outburst contained within the walls of a Montecito mansion. It became the flashpoint that transformed a crumbling marriage into a global spectacle. In the world of celebrity and royalty, nothing remains hidden for long. Whispers travel faster than facts, rumors grow larger than reality, and one single act can eclipse years of crafted narratives. Meghan's scream, followed by the sting of her hand across Harry's face, did not stay confined to that night. It was destined to echo across continents, picked up and magnified by tabloids, social media, and royal insiders who lived for such drama. What should have been a deeply personal moment became the symbol of everything wrong in their union, the story that dominated headlines and coffee table conversations alike. For those close to the couple, the slap was not surprising. Friends, staff, and even distant observers had long noticed the cracks in their relationship. The tension was visible in the stiffness of their body language, the forced smiles during public appearances, the way Harry often appeared withdrawn while Meghan took control of the stage. The slap was the natural escalation of years of unspoken conflict. Yet its exposure to the world gave it a power neither Harry nor Meghan could contain. It began with leaks. Someone close to the household, whether a staff member, a neighbor, or even a confidant, spoke quietly to a tabloid reporter. The story at first was vague. Explosive row at the Sussex mansion, one outlet hinted. Within hours, details sharpened. Sources claimed Meghan had lashed out physically after learning about the divorce papers. Others said her scream was so loud neighbors feared something terrible had happened. Soon, the phrase "the slap heard around the world" appeared, coined by a British columnist who relished in Meghan's humiliation. It spread like wildfire, fueling commentary across television, podcasts, and social platforms. Public opinion split immediately. Some sided with Meghan, arguing she had been blindsided by Harry's betrayal, that any woman in her position would erupt in fury. Others condemned her outright, painting her as unhinged, controlling, incapable of handling rejection. The slap became not just about two individuals, but about everything they represented. Love versus duty, independence versus tradition, ambition versus humility. It became a cultural debate, a symbol for those who either admired or despised Meghan Markle. For Harry, the leak was devastating but clarifying. He had known that once the truth surfaced, the story would no longer be his to control. Yet even he was unprepared for the frenzy. Paparazzi swarmed their property, drones circled overhead, and every movement he made was dissected by the press. His cheek, still bearing the faint redness from Meghan's hand, was photographed when he stepped out for the first time after the confrontation. That image, subtle but undeniable, appeared on front pages with captions like "Harry's silent pain" and "the face of a marriage in ruins." Meghan, meanwhile, scrambled to regain control of the narrative. She convened her publicists, lawyers, and allies in crisis meetings. Her strategy was clear: deny nothing but reframe everything. She portrayed herself as a woman betrayed, a wife who discovered her husband's secret betrayal and reacted in the heat of the moment. She insisted she was the victim, the one blindsided by Harry's cruelty. Her allies in Hollywood echoed this perspective, issuing statements about how any strong woman would react when faced with deception. But no matter how polished her messaging was, the image of that slap lingered. It wasn't just about the act itself, it was about what it revealed, a raw truth that no amount of spin could erase. The royal family, predictably, remained silent publicly, but behind closed doors, their reaction was one of both vindication and concern. For King Charles and Prince William, the slap confirmed what they had long believed. Harry's marriage was toxic, unsustainable, and damaging to the monarchy's reputation. Yet they also knew the world's fascination with the spectacle would inevitably pull them into the narrative. Royal courtiers braced for questions, prepared statements, and strategies to distance the monarchy from the Sussex implosion. They understood the slap wasn't just a domestic squabble, it was an event with global consequences. What made the slap resonate so deeply was its symbolism. It wasn't just a hand striking a face. It was the embodiment of power struggles, of years of manipulation, of two people who had given up everything for each other only to end up as adversaries. For many, it symbolized the end of the fairy tale. The woman once seen as a breath of fresh air, and the prince once hailed as a rebel hero, were now trapped in a story of violence and betrayal. It was Shakespearean in its tragedy, a modern royal drama played out on the stage of global media. Social media amplified the moment to unimaginable heights. Memes, parodies, and commentary flooded timelines. Some mocked Meghan, others mocked Harry, and many simply gawked at the chaos. Hashtags like #Slapgate, #Harry's Revenge, and #Meghan's Meltdown trended worldwide. Analysts on YouTube and podcasts dissected every angle, from the psychology of Meghan's rage to the symbolism of Harry's silence. The slap became not just a news story but a cultural event, something people used to project their own frustrations, debates, and ideologies. Yet beneath the noise, the human cost was immense. Harry, though resolute in his decision, felt the humiliation acutely. To him, the slap was not just a public embarrassment. It was the final confirmation that Meghan saw him less as a partner and more as a possession. Meghan, for her part, oscillated between fury and despair. She had not just lost control of Harry but of the narrative, of the very public image she had spent years cultivating. No amount of tears or spin could erase the fact that the world now saw her not as a wronged wife, but as a woman undone by rage. The slap also ignited fear about the children. If their household could descend into such volatility, what did it mean for their safety and stability? Critics and commentators seized on this angle, questioning custody arrangements and the children's well-being. For Harry's legal team, the slap became leverage, a piece of evidence that strengthened his position in the impending divorce. For Meghan, it was a liability she could not easily escape. As days turned into weeks, the slap continued to dominate headlines. It overshadowed everything else: their past interviews, their charitable ventures, their once carefully crafted image. It became the defining moment of their relationship, the single act that crystallized years of tension into one unforgettable image. And though both Harry and Meghan tried to move past it, to spin it, to bury it beneath new headlines, the world had already decided. This was the moment their marriage truly ended. In the end, the slap heard around the world was more than a physical gesture. It was the culmination of years of resentment, ambition, and conflict. It was the breaking of illusions, the shattering of a story that once captivated millions. And as the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. Harry and Meghan were no longer a couple fighting the world together. They were now fighting each other, and the whole world was watching. Once the story of the slap seeped into the public, the media didn't simply report on it. They devoured it, expanded it, twisted it into 1,000 different versions, and turned it into a spectacle that no one could ignore. This was no longer just a domestic dispute between a husband and wife. It had become an international obsession, a narrative that newspapers, talk shows, social media commentators, and even late-night comedians would seize upon. The frenzy was unlike anything Harry and Meghan had experienced before, and that was saying something for a couple who had been under scrutiny since the very first moment they were linked together. The initial leak spread through British tabloids like wildfire. Editors knew they had gold in their hands, a royal scandal of physical confrontation, betrayal, and divorce. Headlines screamed in bold letters across front pages: Meghan's meltdown, Harry struck by betrayal and by hand, Slapgate shocks the world. It didn't matter that the details were murky or that eyewitness accounts were vague. The story had all the ingredients tabloids craved: royalty, violence, humiliation, and a collapsing marriage. The truth mattered less than the narrative, and the narrative was irresistible. In America, the coverage took a slightly different angle. Talk shows framed Meghan as the victim of secrecy, highlighting Harry's clandestine filing as a betrayal of trust. Some commentators even suggested her slap was the understandable response of a wife blindsided by her husband. Others, however, turned the focus toward Meghan's character, painting her as manipulative, controlling, and incapable of dealing with rejection. Daytime television hosts debated whether Meghan was unhinged or heartbroken. Radio callers lined up to voice opinions, some condemning her, others sympathizing, all feeding the fire. Social media was the true battlefield. Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok became flooded with posts dissecting every angle of the story. Memes emerged within hours. One popular image showed Meghan as a queen chess piece toppling Harry's pawn. Another depicted Harry with a red mark on his cheek captioned "Royal Seal of Divorce." Influencers, comedians, and self-styled royal experts all weighed in, turning the private implosion into public theater. Hashtags like #Slapgate, #Meghan's Meltdown, and #HarryFiles trended worldwide. Videos analyzing Meghan's supposed body language during past interviews racked up millions of views, as users retroactively searched for clues that hinted at the explosion to come. The frenzy soon shifted from the act itself to its implications. Every news network ran specials on what Harry's divorce filing meant for the monarchy, for Meghan's brand, for the future of their children. Commentators debated custody battles, financial settlements, and how Netflix or Spotify might react to the collapse of the couple once touted as the most bankable figures in modern royalty. Legal analysts were brought in to speculate on potential court battles, and psychologists were interviewed about the meaning of Meghan's slap. Was it a sign of desperation, anger, or deep emotional trauma? Harry's side of the story was largely silent at first, but his silence only fueled speculation. Tabloids began quoting insiders, claiming that Harry had been pushed to the brink by years of manipulation, that the slap had only confirmed his fears about the volatility of his marriage. Meghan's camp worked overtime to counteract this, releasing carefully curated stories to sympathetic outlets. These stories painted her as a woman wronged, blindsided by a husband who had plotted behind her back. One source claimed Meghan had simply lashed out in shock, while another described her as devastated but determined to protect her children and her reputation. The frenzy grew so loud that even world leaders and celebrities were asked about it. At press conferences unrelated to the matter, reporters squeezed in questions to see if public figures would comment on the Sussex implosion. Late-night hosts made jokes, comparing the slap to a scene out of a Hollywood drama. Comedians imitated Meghan's scream and Harry's silence, while skits on Saturday Night Live mocked the fallout. For Meghan, this was humiliation on a scale she had never known. For Harry, it was both freeing and devastating. Freeing because the world was finally seeing the cracks, devastating because his personal pain had become public entertainment. What made the frenzy particularly destructive was its persistence. Normally, celebrity scandals burn brightly and fade quickly. But with Harry and Meghan, every small development added fuel to the fire. When Harry was photographed alone at a cafe, headlines speculated he was celebrating freedom. When Meghan was spotted without her wedding ring, it made front-page news as proof of separation. Even silence was interpreted as strategy. Their lives had become an open book, with the world writing the chapters for them. The royal family's silence did little to quell the frenzy. Buckingham Palace maintained its usual no-comment stance, but insiders leaked just enough to keep speculation alive. Rumors circulated that King Charles felt vindicated, that William had warned Harry from the start, that courtiers were quietly preparing for the formal dissolution of titles. The slap, in many ways, vindicated years of royal suspicion about Meghan. Yet even those within the palace understood the danger. The monarchy itself was once again dragged into the mud of scandal, forced to share headlines with the very couple they thought they had distanced themselves from. In Hollywood, the reaction was mixed. Some of Meghan's allies remained loyal, speaking out in her defense and framing the incident as the tragic collapse of a pressured marriage. Others distanced themselves, wary of being tainted by association. Invitations to elite events slowed, offers became more cautious, and whispers circulated about whether Meghan could ever recover her brand. Executives worried whether the Netflix and Spotify deals, already precarious, could survive the fallout. Investors questioned whether the Sussex brand was now permanently damaged. The frenzy also unearthed old wounds. Clips from Oprah's interview resurfaced, with critics now pointing to Meghan's statements and questioning their authenticity. Harry's memoir was re-examined, passages dissected for clues that foreshadowed the implosion. Every past quote, every gesture, every interview was now seen through the lens of collapse, and the media delighted in rewriting the couple's story in hindsight. For the public, the frenzy was entertainment, but for Harry and Meghan, it was suffocation. The slap was no longer just a moment. It was a label, a defining event that overshadowed everything else. Meghan's scream had echoed far beyond their home, and now it reverberated in every headline, every news broadcast, every conversation. Harry's quiet filing had unleashed not just a legal battle, but a storm of judgment, ridicule, and fascination. The frenzy did not simply ignite, it consumed. It consumed their privacy, their reputations, and whatever fragile bond remained between them. For Meghan, the firestorm was a nightmare she couldn't control. For Harry, it was confirmation that his choice to file for divorce was necessary. The world was now watching, dissecting, and waiting for the next chapter in what had become the most dramatic royal saga of the century. The world had already chosen sides, dissecting the slap, the scream, and the chaos that followed. Meghan's narrative was being broadcast by her allies, but Harry's voice remained curiously absent in the public arena. To the press, his silence was a blank canvas onto which they could project anything they wanted. To Meghan, it was an opportunity to shape herself as the wronged woman before he could speak. But inside Harry's world, away from the cameras and headlines, a very different story was unfolding. This was not the tale of a man who had betrayed his wife in secret. This was the story of a man who had reached the limits of endurance, who had finally broken free from years of suffocation, manipulation, and loneliness disguised as love. For Harry, the decision to file for divorce was not born of impulse. It had been a slow build, a process of realization that chipped away at him piece by piece. He remembered vividly the early days of their relationship, when Meghan had seemed to understand him in ways no one else ever had. She had listened, nodded, encouraged him to express his feelings, something the royal family rarely allowed. She had given him the illusion of sanctuary. But over the years, that illusion cracked. What once felt like freedom had become another kind of prison, one built not of duty to the monarchy, but of relentless ambition and control. Harry's side of the story was one of erosion. Every argument left him a little more withdrawn. Every demand for appearances, for interviews, for brand deals made him feel less like himself and more like a product to be marketed. He began to realize that Meghan's love often came with conditions. He had to play the part, smile when told, defend her narrative, and silence his doubts. If he faltered, if he questioned, if he dared to want something different, the atmosphere in their home turned icy. Harry learned to bite his tongue, to suppress his frustrations, but the weight grew unbearable. One of his confidants, someone he trusted deeply, later revealed that Harry would often call late at night, his voice heavy with exhaustion. He spoke about feeling invisible in his own marriage, about how his children were becoming props in a game of image and influence. He admitted he felt guilty for dragging them into this life, guilty for leaving the monarchy only to thrust them into a different spotlight. Most damning of all, he confessed he no longer recognized himself when he looked in the mirror. The boy who once laughed freely with soldiers, who once found solace in the wilds of Africa, had been replaced by a man haunted by cameras and contracts. Harry's silence in public was not weakness, it was strategy. He knew Meghan excelled at controlling the narrative, at rallying allies to her cause. But he also knew the truth did not need to be shouted. It simply needed to be revealed, carefully, when the time was right. His legal team advised restraint, and Harry agreed. Let Meghan spin her story in the short term. The world would eventually see the bigger picture. Privately, Harry began documenting his own side. Notes, recordings, journal entries. All pieces of his experience he could eventually use, whether in court or in his own defense. He wrote about the loneliness of his nights, about arguments that stretched for hours, about feeling mocked and belittled when he expressed his longing for a simpler life. He noted how Meghan dismissed his concerns as weakness, how she accused him of clinging to the past. He recorded the growing gulf between them, the loss of intimacy, the way their partnership had shifted from love to strategy. What haunted him most was the impact on their children. Archie and Lilibet were innocent, yet they were already being raised in a world of image and branding. Harry remembered his own childhood, the trauma of losing his mother, the relentless paparazzi who stalked his every move. He had sworn he would never let his children suffer the same fate. But as he watched Meghan stage moments for cameras, as he saw their lives reduced to content for deals, he realized he was repeating the very cycle he had fled. Filing for divorce was not only about saving himself, it was about saving them. Harry's side of the story also carried anger, though it was quieter, more controlled than Meghan's explosive rage. He felt anger at being treated as secondary in his own marriage, anger at being told his worth was tied to her vision. He resented how his vulnerability, the very thing Meghan once praised, had become a weapon used against him in arguments. He bristled at how his desire for privacy was labeled weakness, while her hunger for attention was framed as ambition. Over time, he saw the truth. Their marriage was less a partnership and more a performance, and he was no longer willing to play his role. When news of the slap reached the world, Harry stayed silent not because he was ashamed, but because he understood the power of restraint. Meghan's scream, her fury, and her hand across his face had spoken louder than anything he could say. To the world, that single act revealed what he had endured for years. He didn't need to embellish or explain. The truth had already been broadcast in that one symbolic moment. Still, Harry prepared himself for the battles ahead. He knew Meghan would not go quietly. She would fight with every tool at her disposal: media allies, Hollywood friends, legal maneuvers. But Harry was ready. For the first time in years, he felt clarity. He knew who he was, what he wanted, and what he would no longer tolerate. The boy who had been defined by the crown, the man who had been overshadowed by his wife's ambition, was now stepping forward as his own person. Harry's side of the story was not about revenge, it was about survival. He had given everything to Meghan, and in return, he had been diminished. Now, he was reclaiming his life, his voice, and his freedom. He knew the road ahead would be brutal. The media frenzy was only beginning. The legal war loomed large, and the emotional toll would be heavy. But deep inside, Harry felt something he hadn't felt in years: resolve. He was ready to face the storm, not as Meghan's husband, not as the spare prince, but as himself. The world would eventually hear his story in full, through interviews, through documents, perhaps even through another book. But for now, his silence was his shield. Meghan's side was loud, but Harry's truth was steady, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The slap had been heard around the world, but soon, it would be Harry's quiet voice that would cut through the noise. And when it did, the narrative would shift, not just about his marriage, but about who he truly was beyond the shadow of love and royalty. If there was one thing the world had learned about Meghan Markle, it was that she would never allow herself to be cast as the loser in any story. Her entire life, from her early acting days to her climb into the heart of one of the most powerful families on earth, had been a study in reinvention. And now, facing the humiliation of the slap becoming public and the revelation that Harry had filed for divorce in secret, Meghan's instinct was not to retreat, but to retaliate. The Meghan the world saw in those days was not a woman crushed by betrayal, but a fighter preparing to reclaim control of a narrative slipping through her fingers. Her first move was strategic. While Harry remained silent, Meghan knew silence would destroy her. She called in her closest circle, publicists, attorneys, media allies, and a handful of Hollywood figures who had benefited from her patronage. They gathered in her mansion, phones buzzing, laptops open, charting out the battle like generals in a war room. The strategy was simple: shift the lens from Meghan's actions to Harry's betrayal. She would frame herself as a woman blindsided by secrecy, a wife whose trust had been shattered, and a mother determined to protect her children from the fallout. The slap, in this framing, was not an act of violence, but a moment of human weakness under unimaginable stress. Within days, sympathetic outlets began running features defending Meghan. They highlighted her sacrifices, leaving her acting career, giving up her independence, weathering attacks from the British press, and moving across the world for Harry. These articles painted Harry as ungrateful, unstable, and even reckless for filing for divorce without his wife's knowledge. Meghan herself didn't speak directly to the press yet, but her fingerprints were all over the coverage. Carefully crafted sound bites from sources close to the Duchess began appearing. One described her as heartbroken but resilient. Another called her a mother first, determined to protect Archie and Lilibet. The strategy was clear. Meghan would recast herself not as the aggressor but as the victim, a woman fighting for survival in the face of betrayal. But Meghan's retaliation wasn't confined to media spin. She also struck back in the legal arena. Her attorneys began filing motions to challenge Harry's divorce strategy, demanding mediation on her terms and threatening to expose private details if negotiations didn't favor her. To Harry, this was confirmation of everything he feared, that Meghan would weaponize every detail of their life to maintain control. His legal team braced for impact, knowing Meghan's lawyers were ruthless and fully aware of the power of leaks. Social media became her second battlefield. Meghan's loyal supporters amplified her narrative, creating hashtags that trended alongside those attacking her. While hashtag Slapgate still dominated, new hashtags emerged. Hashtag Stand With Meghan, hashtag Betrayed by Harry. Influencers aligned with Meghan released posts supporting her, framing the divorce as an example of misogyny and betrayal. Meghan herself carefully curated her own online presence, appearing in candid photographs walking with her children, ring absent from her finger but chin defiantly raised. Each image told a story. She was wounded, yes, but she was strong, a woman wronged yet unbroken. Her next move was perhaps the most daring: Hollywood. Meghan began quietly reaching out to her celebrity allies. exploring opportunities to re-establish her brand independent of Harry. There were whispers of new projects, potential collaborations, even talk of a tell-all memoir that would reveal the truth about her marriage. Executives, though wary of the scandal, couldn't ignore the sheer publicity Meghan generated. She was polarizing, but polarizing meant profitable. For Meghan, every headline, positive or negative, was proof she still mattered. What unsettled Harry most was the personal strike Meghan launched through carefully leaked anecdotes. Stories began appearing in the press about Harry's supposed instability, his emotional struggles, and his alleged inability to handle stress without her guidance. Anonymous sources claimed Meghan had held their family together, while Harry spiraled, suggesting that his decision to file for divorce was irrational and dangerous. These leaks were devastating to Harry's reputation, painting him as the problem while Meghan played the role of the strong, wronged wife. Harry knew the stories were distortions, but he also knew Meghan was winning the short-term war of perception. Behind closed doors, Meghan's retaliation carried a different tone. Friends described her as oscillating between rage and icy calculation. At times she screamed about betrayal, throwing objects across the room, vowing to destroy Harry publicly. At other times, she was cold and focused, dictating strategy with precision, her emotions buried beneath ambition. She told her allies that Harry had underestimated her, that she would never allow herself to be discarded quietly. Her rage was not just about the divorce, it was about power. Losing Harry meant losing the very platform that had made her more than an actress. It was an existential threat, and Meghan was determined to fight as though her entire identity depended on it. What made Meghan's retaliation so potent was her mastery of public emotion. She understood that people didn't follow facts, they followed feelings. By leaning into the role of the betrayed wife, she tapped into a narrative as old as time, one that resonated deeply with audiences. And though many still criticized her, the sheer volume of debate kept her in the spotlight. In Meghan's world, silence was death, and noise, any noise, meant survival. But there was a cost. In striking back so fiercely, Meghan risked alienating allies who preferred discretion. Some of her Hollywood friends, already wary of the negative publicity, began distancing themselves quietly. Invitations dwindled, collaborations stalled. Meghan's aggressive pushback kept her in the headlines, but it also revealed how far she was willing to go, even if it meant burning bridges. Harry, though battered by her attacks, found quiet strength in this. He recognized that every move she made only confirmed what he had felt for years, that Meghan's loyalty was not to their marriage but to her own survival. The clash between them was no longer just a private war. It was a global battle fought across courtrooms, news outlets, and social media platforms. Meghan's strikes were sharp, relentless, designed to humiliate Harry and recast herself. But Harry, in his silence, wielded something Meghan could not control: patience. While she raged and strategized, he watched, waited, and prepared. The battle lines were drawn, and both sides knew there was no going back. For Meghan, striking back was not just about saving her marriage. It was about saving her empire, her image, her very sense of self. For Harry, her retaliation was further proof that he had made the right decision. The woman he once loved had become his fiercest adversary, and their war was only beginning. Back in Britain, the news of Harry's secret divorce filing and the explosive fallout with Meghan landed like a thunderclap inside palace walls. For years, the royal family had watched from a distance as Harry and Meghan's story unfolded across oceans, headlines, and streaming platforms. They had endured accusations, endured interviews that painted them as villains, endured the slow but steady corrosion of the monarchy's public image at the hands of Harry and Meghan's revelations. And now, with divorce looming, the palace could no longer pretend it was merely a private matter. This was a royal crisis, one that demanded careful calculation, restraint, and above all, survival of the institution. The first reaction came in silence, the palace's oldest and most practiced defense. Official statements were non-existent. A no-comment stance was quietly issued to every inquiry from journalists. Courtiers were instructed to stick to the script. The Sussexes were private citizens, and their marital affairs were not a matter for the crown. Yet behind the polished veneer of restraint, the atmosphere was far less composed. Inside Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Kensington Palace, private conversations carried tones of vindication, frustration, and even relief. King Charles reportedly received the news with a grim nod. Those closest to him said he had long believed Harry's marriage was unsustainable, that Meghan's presence was more disruptive than stabilizing. Charles, ever mindful of legacy, saw in this collapse a dangerous threat. Another scandal that could destabilize the monarchy at a time when it was already fighting for relevance in a modern world. Yet part of him also felt vindicated, as if history had proven him right. He had warned Harry in quieter times about the weight of marrying someone whose ambitions might clash with royal duty. Now, with the slap heard around the world, that warning had come full circle. Prince William's reaction was far sharper. The rift between the brothers had grown into a chasm since Harry left Britain, but William's anger had never fully extinguished his concern. In private, William was said to be furious, not with Harry for divorcing, but with the humiliation Meghan's meltdown had once again inflicted on the family. For William, who had carefully crafted his image as a steady heir to the throne, Meghan's volatility was not just Harry's problem, it was everyone's. He reportedly told aides that Harry had finally seen the truth, but the damage was already done. The monarchy's reputation had been dragged into yet another public storm, and William resented the fact that his family was once again being overshadowed by Harry's chaos. Queen Camilla, ever the pragmatist, viewed the divorce as both a danger and an opportunity. She privately confided to close friends that the scandal could further cement public fatigue with Harry and Meghan, tilting sympathy back toward the monarchy. Yet she also worried about Meghan's capacity for retaliation. Camilla, who had lived through decades of being vilified by the press, understood all too well how a relentless woman could weaponize her image. She warned Charles and William that Meghan would not go down quietly, that every secret she knew about the royals might now be leveraged in her war against Harry. To Camilla, the divorce was not the end of trouble. It was the beginning of an entirely new battle. Within the palace staff, the reaction was a mixture of relief and schadenfreude. Many courtiers had never warmed to Meghan, seeing her as a disruptive force who refused to adapt to royal life. To them, the collapse of her marriage to Harry was confirmation of what they had suspected from the beginning, that Meghan was more interested in the platform than the partnership. Whispers circulated in corridors, some mocking, others sympathetic, but all united in one understanding. This scandal would shape the monarchy's future for years to come. The Queen's absence was felt deeply in these moments. Elizabeth II had been the steady anchor of the family, a figure whose quiet authority often calmed storms before they spiraled. But with her gone, there was no unifying presence to mitigate the crisis. Charles's leadership, William's ambition, and Camilla's pragmatism all clashed in subtle ways, leaving the family scrambling to contain the fallout. Publicly, the royal family continued to project calm. Official engagements went on as scheduled. William and Catherine were photographed smiling at a children's event. Charles gave a speech about climate change. Camilla attended a charity gala. Yet every public appearance carried with it an unspoken subtext. The family was moving forward, presenting stability in the face of Harry and Meghan's collapse. The contrast was deliberate. Where Meghan screamed and slapped, the royals smiled and shook hands. Where Meghan dominated chaotic headlines, the monarchy projected serene continuity. Still, the family was not immune to speculation. Journalists and royal watchers demanded to know how Charles truly felt, how William would respond, whether the divorce meant Harry might return to Britain in some capacity. The palace deflected, but the questions grew louder. Some even speculated whether Harry would be stripped of his titles once the divorce was finalized, a move that would further sever him from the institution he had once rebelled against. Charles, cautious of overreach, resisted the idea for the moment, but the possibility lingered in the air. For Catherine, Princess of Wales, the scandal struck a quieter chord. Though she remained dignified in public, those close to her said she worried about the toll on Harry as a brother and as a father. She knew the pain of fractured families, and while her loyalty lay with William and the crown, she carried private sorrow at the thought of Harry's turmoil. Catherine reportedly told a confidant that while Meghan had been wrong for Harry, the collapse of their marriage was still tragic, especially for the children. As the royal family weighed its options, one thing became clear. The divorce would not just reshape Harry and Meghan's lives. It would ripple through the monarchy itself. The family's reputation, its stability, and its ability to project unity were all at stake. For Charles, William, and Camilla, the goal was simple: survive the scandal while allowing Harry and Meghan to burn themselves out in the public eye. For Harry, the hope of reconciliation with his family seemed distant, but the collapse of his marriage opened a door, however faint, to a future where he might rebuild ties. For Meghan, the palace knew this was war, and she would use every weapon she had. The royal family's reactions, though muted in public, revealed the deeper truth. They had always been waiting for this moment. Meghan's scream, the slap, the divorce filing, none of it surprised them. What mattered now was how they would navigate the storm, and whether the monarchy could emerge stronger from the spectacle of a marriage that had once promised to rewrite history but had instead become a cautionary tale.